Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. This is Rappler Talk. Joining us today from Washington, D.C. is Professor Zach Abuza of the National War College. He is a political and security analyst who's written several books on Southeast Asia, and in particular, the security threat in Southeast Asia, both Jamaat Islamiyah linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Zach, thank you for joining us.
What a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's very early your time. Tell me, what was your reaction to Paris?
Completely expected. This is what we've seen as the modus operandi for terrorist groups really going back to 2008 with the Lashkar-e-Taiba takeover of the hotels in Mumbai, India. We've seen this again and again around the world, these barricade-style attacks. They are low cost. They require very little technical expertise. All you need are small arms. You do not need a lot of logistics or bomb-making skills. And they can really drag on an incident over hours to maximize the media saturation.
So how can authorities protect against something like this?
Oh, you really can. It's good intelligence sharing on people who have been to Iraq and Syria and returned, trying to monitor them and keep tabs. But there's not a lot that the security forces really can do beyond that, unless we're willing to completely give up civil liberties.
Many analysts writing about Paris in the days after seem to think that this was a new signal, that it's moving from lone wolf attacks, at least like the Boston Marathon and other things that we've seen, to now more central coordination from ISIS, or this is the specter of central coordination. Do you believe this?
I don't know yet, and I think I need to. I don't know that much about ISIS Central because I do really concentrate on Southeast Asia. But this is something we did see debates within Al-Qaeda, whether everything needed to be from the center, an organization, or whether it was acceptable for Al-Qaeda-inspired groups, which is what one of the main competitors to Osama bin Laden was advocating. I think you're seeing the same thing with ISIS. They certainly have had inspired attacks by local self-operating groups who've simply been inspired. But as they go up the complexity chain, yes, you might need a little more logistical support from the from ISIS Central.
And how would you define, so this is what's happening globally. I mean, what an incredibly busy weekend and last week was for world leaders, going from G20 to APEC to ASEAN in this part of the world. And they all condemned the attacks. They said that they were going to work together. And certainly we saw counterattacks from the US-led coalition. But in Southeast Asia, what impact do you think this would have on Southeast Asia, and what should we be looking out for?
Yes, it certainly got a lot of attention in the summit in Manila and then in Kuala Lumpur. Paris did shock the global leadership, but these things have been going on. I mean, you had suicide attacks the day before in Beirut. You had in Bamako in Mali a very similar barricade-style attack. In Southeast Asia, we need to really be concerned about this style attack, simply because most of the Southeast Asians who have gone to fight with ISIS have been used as cannon fodder. And if I could use the JI example, not everyone who returns is a Dr. Azahari, a very trained bomb maker. Most people have limited skills with small arms, and so this is in their range of capabilities.
And how do you think authorities are dealing with this right now?
In Southeast Asia, the difference between the rise of ISIS and the rise of Al-Qaeda is that the leadership in the region is not in denial. boy, after 9/11, you just had so much political reluctance to join the US-led coalition to the point that leaders politically hampered their security services from doing their job. Malaysia has been uncharacteristically proactive about this, Indonesia as well. There are calls for greater intelligence sharing, which is absolutely essential. One of the things we know from people who have been arrested and detained in Indonesia and Malaysia so far is that the only reason there are not more Southeast Asians going to Iraq and Syria is the logistical pipeline. And simply leaving Southeast Asia and the intelligence sharing and the watching of flight manifests, who's traveling to Turkey, who's trying to make their way to the Middle East, that's improved so much. And so this is really important. What's also important is we've got to get other countries in the region that might not feel that they're in the first tier or ISIS is a first tier threat, but which might be useful for those trying to travel. So while Indonesia and Malaysia might be on high alert for anyone flying to Turkey, someone transiting Vietnam or Bangkok might not appear on the radar screen. So we just need a lot more cooperation in the region.
Let's talk about the actual threat itself. I mean, we've seen ISIS actually entice more foreign fighters than Al-Qaeda ever did during its peak time in Afghanistan, right? The last estimates I saw were roughly about 30,000 foreign fighters going to Syria and Iraq. In Southeast Asia, those estimates are wild, going from as low as 500 to 1,000, I guess. Could you give us an idea of the numbers of Southeast Asians who have gone, and then take us through the threats in each country, in Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines?
All right. Yes, the numbers of Southeast Asians do vary from about 500 to 1,000. If you could, let me break it down. 1,000 is possible in terms of citizens who have gone to Syria, but not all are fighters. Many have brought their family members, wives, and children. We know there is already a Bahasa language school in Raqqa. So not all are fighters. And that figure also includes those who have been killed fighting, as well as those who have already returned, and many of those have been arrested. So the threat actually isn't right now. The real threat is in 1 or 2 years, when you start to get a critical mass who have returned to the region. So the numbers are there. I am concerned that, as was the case with Afghanistan a couple decades ago already, that they return back on pedestals in their community. They set up madrasas as hate factories and ideological incubators. I hope the security services are going to be more proactive about that in this case.
So let's talk about Indonesia, yeah. So let's look at Indonesia as the country that has world's largest Muslim population. It was ground zero for many of the attacks during the times of Jemaah Islamiyah, right? And now ISIS, I guess, give us an idea of the threat in Indonesia, Malaysia. I said the Philippines, but please add Singapore as well.
In Indonesia, we have a large number of people, but who have been recruited. Again, it's the pipeline issue, the logistical challenge getting there. Earlier this year, a major financier and logistics operative was arrested, so hopefully things will be further crimped there. But the returnees have already tried to perpetrate attacks, including in last February, a chlorine bomb attack in a mall in Jakarta. And this is completely new for Southeast Asia. I should note that the barricade style attacks were being adopted by JI in the latter years when the group was under threat. And in 2010, they had a large training camp in Aceh that was practicing for these attacks. So it's something that has already been considered in Indonesia by militants. We have the success of ISIS has revitalized terrorist networks there.
Yeah.
They certainly have received the endorsement of people like Abu Bakr Bashir and his organization, the JAT. The most lethal of all the splinter successors of JI, the Mujahideen Indonesia Timor, or MIT, has pledged loyalty to ISIS and is still the most lethal and most active terrorist group in the country right now.
So in Malaysia, we saw during that time when there were several people beheaded in Syria, 2 Malaysians were part of that, and we've already seen 1 Indonesian suicide bomber and a Malaysian suicide bomber in Syria, correct?
3 Malaysians.
3.
So far.
Please tell. So let's look at Malaysia, and Malaysia has actually been quite proactive in saying that they've thwarted several plots, bomb plots against ASEAN earlier, an ASEAN meeting earlier this year. And then, what did you make of the leaked report that talked about 10 suicide bombers?
Malaysia was spared the violence during JI's reign of terror, and so the authorities have already broken up 3 plots that were beyond the planning stage. I mean, the cells were trying to acquire weapons, explosives, and put together a bomb, has really rattled the security forces in Malaysia. The other thing that is very worrying to Malaysian authorities is that ISIS recruitment in the country is much broader than what JI was traditionally able to do. Coming out of a handful of madrasas, certain hate factories, the recruitment for ISIS, especially in Malaysia, has been across the socioeconomic spectrum, from unemployed workers to civil servants to doctors to students to members of the security forces. So this is really upsetting the security forces. Already, we have had the arrest and trial of one small cell that was trying to orchestrate a barricade-style attack and assassination of leaders. So they are aware that this threat is coming in. It is not just bombs, but that is present. There have been 3 active bombing threats.
And in Malaysia, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
And as we said, that the genie is out of the bottle with regards to Malaysian suicide bombers.
And in Malaysia, the number of arrests you're talking about is over 150, is that correct?
It's between 120 to 150, somewhere in there. I've gotten mixed messages from different parts of the government.
Let's talk about the Philippines. Again, it seems like when we talk about fighters who have gone to Syria and Iraq, there's the majority are from Indonesia, followed by Malaysia, then Singapore is a third. And in the Philippines, what do you have about the Philippines?
Well, right now, I don't have any evidence that there are Filipinos who have joined ISIS. It doesn't mean they're not there. They could blend in very easily with other Southeast Asians. But it's certainly a matter of time before they start to make their way. We do have, in mid-2014, Islam Aplan of the Abu Sayyaf did pledge bayat to ISIS.
Right.
I personally see it as much more of a publicity stunt than anything a meaningful alliance. But again, they're fishing for international support.
And then in terms of Singapore, Singapore has announced that it actually stopped lone wolves. And then we've already also had a Singapore suicide bomber, is that correct?
I didn't know about that.
Okay, I'm wrong. I just wanted to make sure. But I know the Malaysians. So in Singapore, what I know they've said is that they've arrested people coming in and out and
Yes.
cells. Correct.
Yeah, and there have been Singaporeans who have left, brought their family members as well. So it's again, it's going to be a smaller threat, and the Singaporean security forces are obviously very well resourced and able to control their borders better than anyone else, having few points of entry. But this is obviously something that they are going to have to continue cooperation with, as Singapore is a regional transit hub.
Two trends that were pinpointed was a greater number of women, the role of women. I mean, they've always been there in the past, cementing ties between different extremist groups, but now they seem to be more empowered, and these increasing online marriages. That sounds interesting. Also, could you tell us more about these?
I think that's a really important point. For JI, women were there in the background, as you said, as the major agents of socialization and for their children, but also for cementing these alliances between families. Malaysian authorities used to say that JI was about 150 interconnected families. And while that was an oversimplification, there was a lot of truth to that, that the intermarriage was really important. You don't see that in ISIS. But one of the things you do see is that because recruitment is happening outside of the madrasa, it's happening online through social media, women are playing a primary role in this. And it's not just in Southeast Asia, it's around the
The
world.
world.
And so, but in Southeast Asia, almost every major cell that's been broken up so far has had a woman as the head of recruitment or finance, key ideological recruiters. They play very active roles versus JI, where they played very passive behind the scenes roles.
Interesting. Go ahead.
And with regards to the marriage, yes, there have been a few cases of Southeast Asians being lured to Syria and Iraq for these jihadist arranged marriages. That could increase, but so far it's been fairly limited.
And the role of social media. I mean, we've been talking about this for a while, how social media can take the networks and spread the ideology faster. How do you see it? How has it played out in the last year?
Well, if you could compare it to JI, which was a multi-year recruitment process, it was a lot of education being taken aside after studying at madrasas and having private tutoring lessons, just being brought up through the ideological ziggurat. In the case of ISIS, recruitment, the period of recruitment to trying to get on a plane to go to Iraq and Syria is within days. And so the role of social media is really important in Southeast Asia. The other thing is that ISIS has just such slick propaganda, and it is tailor-made for smartphones and tablets, which are ubiquitous across Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is incredibly wired, especially in the urban areas. Everyone has 3 and 4G phones, and so this propaganda does spread wildly throughout Southeast Asia.
In terms of the global ambitions of ISIS, many analysts, I think including you at some point, everyone was saying that ISIS is different from Al Qaeda in the sense that it's after land, that it is looking at trying to keep this land and grow it. It's a beacon for inspiring other Muslims who want to create a caliphate, but that it doesn't have that same global ambition, at least except perhaps it's changed now, the same global ambition Al Qaeda had, which meant that they would harness these homegrown groups and organize them in a central manner. Do you see this? How would you describe ISIS's global ambitions, and is this changing?
So Al Qaeda was committed to spreading Islam and eventually establishing the caliphate. And their goal was, you had these debates within Al Qaeda over strategy and tactics, whether you target the near or far enemy. And, Osama bin Laden said, you have to go after America because they are what prop up these corrupt apostate regimes in the Middle East. And if you could drive them away, then those governments fall and we can declare a caliphate. But they were never there yet. ISIS physically controls land and has preempted everyone by declaring the establishment of the caliphate, which has attracted others. I believe that ISIS has every intention of spreading, but it's more such as that stone in a pond with the ripples going out, emanating outward from where they are. But I think as America and France and other countries step up their direct attacks on ISIS, they are going to have to respond.
We've certainly seen attacks, counterattacks, both physically with the airstrikes over the last week and then after Paris, and then on social media. Where do you see this? Is this escalation going to take us to a new place, or do you see this kind of like the Al Qaeda threat just continuing, rippling over the next few years?
My guess is what we're seeing now is going to be what we see in the coming future. I'm not sure that they have the capabilities to perpetrate much more sophisticated attacks than what they're doing. But again, they've already experimented with chlorine bombs. We just don't know.
And in terms of the U.S.-led coalition, that response, the U.S. does not want boots on the ground. It was late coming to Syria. I mean, how would you assess the performance now against this threat?
We're certainly not going to defeat them from air attacks, and yet I am personally very reluctant to endorse boots on the ground. To me, that is going to be a horrific and costly quagmire that will simply infuriate Muslims around the world that America is once again trying to occupy a Muslim land. And I think it would ultimately be counterproductive. I support President Obama's position that right now what we should be doing is containing ISIS and slowly degrading them and trying to build up an international coalition to help with some of the burden sharing and costs. That to me, it might not be satisfying to Joe Sixpack, who wants to take on ISIS immediately. And yet no one in America wants to see their taxes rise to pay for increased military action. It's just become a political football in the presidential campaign. But right now, there's a prudent course of action. It's not sexy, it's not fast, but it will help contain ISIS, and hopefully ISIS begins to collapse under its own weight. And I think this is very important, that the only thing that can really defeat ISIS is a popular reaction within the Muslim world in general and within Iraq and Syria, where they are trying to occupy and govern in particular.
So fascinating. Earlier, you actually said that it's very difficult to protect against these small attacks that aren't necessarily related to any central command. Your suggestions for what governments in Southeast Asia can do, what communities should be doing?
So right now, I think we simply need a lot more intelligence sharing on people who are traveling to the Iraq and Syria, returning. That is very important. But what I would like the governments to do more than anything else is there have been returnees who have come back who have been very disillusioned with ISIS. They been thought they were sold a bill of goods. They were promised high salaries or housing, etc., for their families. These people should be given soapboxes, and government should actively use them to undermine ISIS ideology. And I just have not seen that right now. There's a debate brewing whether, in Indonesia, for example, whether you need legislation to criminalize having gone to Iraq and Syria to fight with ISIS. It's not a crime. And some people say we have to criminalize that. Other people say we should strip citizenship. I'm against those proposals. I actually say let them come back and see the degree to which they will discredit ISIS, because no one can discredit ISIS better than people that have been there and fought with them.
And disconnect. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and there are limits to what we can do on social media. I know that governments are often talking about shutting down ISIS websites and social media pages linked to them, or simply have supporters. That's a fool's errand. They proliferate too quickly. And we cannot undermine free speech in the region, which has already taken such hits in the past couple of years.
And this connects to the last question I have, which is earlier this year, in February this year, the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism began. It was the first time the United States actually moved in this space to try to deal with what's happening both in the physical world and in the virtual world, of trying to contain the ideology by narratives of formers, right? As you pointed out. How is that going? Do enough governments, I mean, Singapore started a CVE program in 2003. Australia has its own government ministry that takes care of CVE. How are we doing globally in terms of trying to come together with a counter narrative that addresses vulnerable youths in marginalized communities?
Probably a poor job. You know, I do worry when governments get involved in this, because it is, they have their agenda, and it's just not as natural a reaction than something that comes right up through the grassroots. I think there are things governments can do to help support those who are speaking out. But they should not be taking the lead on this. You need organizations like in the UK, Quilliam,
yes.
Or other organizations like that around the world that are made up of former members of these groups who realize that their religion has been hijacked for political ends by a bunch of psychopaths.
The impact, I know I said last question, this really is the last question. I mean, in terms of the Muslim communities now, obviously there's an immediate backlash on the Syrian refugees, the refugees coming out of Syria, governments kind of clamping down on giving them refuge. What impact do you see this having on both those refugees and then the Muslim communities around the world?
What's happening, the refugee crisis, is heartbreaking. But the only thing more heartbreaking to me is the reaction of Western governments who have turned so callous against them and see these poor refugees as security risks. This is simply going to infuriate people across the Muslim world. It certainly plays into ISIS narrative. If I could bring it closer to home, to Southeast Asia, we have our own indigenous refugee crisis there with the Rohingya.
Right.
It's going to be sailing season again, and expect large numbers of people fleeing ethnic cleansing or being put into camps in the Rakhine state. Ultra-Buddhist nationalism targeting these individuals, even after the election when they're no longer political fodder. This is something governments are going to have to tackle head on, because it really plays into the narrative that the international community does not care about the plight of Muslims.
Wonderful. Any last thoughts, Zach?
Well, on that last note, I think it's absolutely admirable that the one country that stepped up during the height of the Rohingya crisis last year was actually the Philippines, a country that had no dog in the fight, was not a country that had anything to gain but did the right thing. And I think that's very important moral leadership, and I hope that we see it not just from the Philippines but other countries.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Follow Zach Abuza at Zach, Z-A-C-H, Abuza. And if you've got any questions on Twitter, he's there. We'll continue this conversation. You'll see him again taking a look at developments as they happen. Professor Zachary Abuza from the National War College in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, Zach.
What a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.